Hello, good afternoon. Hope you can see and hear me. Welcome to third session about neuroscience in Ipsos. Today's my guest is Ian Payne. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Snežana Savić. I'm a commercial research director in Ipsos East Adria. And today, as in previous sessions too, I will introduce my today's speaker. He will talk about the PAC testing and application of eye tracking as a special technique in neuroscience intended for PAC testing. So today I'm especially excited because we will present a result of the study that we designed for this purpose, and today we're going to see the results. Maybe you remember that we at the first session we introduced design of the study of two new brands. Actually, one brand that we invented, that's beer brand. We invented and call it Kovač. And we also proposed and designed for this study two different routes. We call them red and green line, and you will see which one is better in the research than we have done in last 2 weeks. My colleague Jan will present the results and also teach us how to interpret and how to apply the eye tracking inside of PAC testing. He's a specialist for PAC testing in Ipsos and one of most important persons in area of PAC testing for us. So I hope you will enjoy this lecture. I would say lecture because it should be like a training for better understanding. And Jan, please present your results.
I'd be very happy to. So thanks for the introduction. I hope you can see me well, and I hope you can see my screen well, and I hope you can hear me. Please let me know if that's not the case. But right now, you should be seeing a screen with two beautiful packagings that we just heard about from our new brand called Kovač. And this is going to be, an important part of our presentation today, as was just mentioned. We're going to be looking at the application of eye tracking to PAC testing. We're going to do that through our case study, as I mentioned, but we're also going to, think about some context and to put context around why packaging matters today, and therefore why research matters, and therefore why integrating measures like eye tracking matters, in order that we can then, look at our results with a good deal of context. I think my presentation is probably about 35 minutes or thereabouts, but I'll be mindful of time. And if there's any direction from outside, then please let me know. So, some context about why PAC matters for our clients and for me as a consumer and me as a citizen, let's say. We've seen a case, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, that packaging is really, part of the innovation story. So in the past, PAC's been a bit more about label design, and it's been a bit more about the brand, and it's been, of course, about managing distinctive assets, all of the things that we recognize immediately when we shop and when we choose a brand. But you can see with some of the examples here that the issue of sustainability has a massive influence on development. Issues around e-commerce, especially following 2020, and the acceleration related to COVID is having a very big influence in terms of our clients' development plans as well. And beyond that, we're leveraging packaging in new and different ways as well. So whether packaging be, about label change, whether it be about format change, whether it be about real functional change in order to bring relevant packs to an e-commerce environment, for example, the basic point is that things are happening. There's a lot of innovation, there's a lot of focus from our clients, so therefore the role of PAC and the role of PAC testing becomes increasingly important and increasingly top of mind. Now, in some cases, PACs can change in a very significant way. This is a famous example, you might be aware of it. I think it was from about 10 years ago in the US. And we can see a brand, a very established leader, Tropicana, making a very big change because they wanted to evolve into a more current or modern state. Now, you can look at those two packs and you can probably recognize that, yeah, the pack on the right is a bit more modern, it's a bit more minimalistic. So, what happened? In this case, the outcome was actually very, very significant. The client, PepsiCo, saw sales drop by 20% after the launch of this new design, basically because people struggled to find it. And when I say struggled, in the first few seconds, they were at shelf, they were in front of the refrigerator, they didn't see Tropicana, so they went to other brands in their repertoire. So the very real impact of pack change here had a very significant effect on sales. Now, happy to mention that Ipsos didn't test this, but it's a very, very famous example. More kind of typical for pack testing is incremental change. So here, in contrast to what we just looked at there, at the other end of the scale, it is a brand, Nutella from Ferrero, being really careful in terms of managing its assets. So over the period of 50, 60 years, even from 1965 to today, we can see that the brand hasn't really changed. And that, of course, drives saliency. It drives immediate positive associations for us as consumers because the strength of the packaging is so recognized, it's so identified with the experience of Nutella that it's absolutely essential to the brand. So what we see when we test pack typically at Ipsos is that change is rather incremental. So it's not that big type of change that we saw from Tropicana, it's more subtle changes, and we see that reflected in the data. For example, what we see in the chart there is the change in findability, a change in visibility at shelf. And most of the time, it's only a few points, a few percentage points different going from current state to new state. So the impact of pack change tends to be quite limited when you manage your assets, when you manage your pack in a very careful way. Now, this has implications for research, of course, because when we make decisions on pack, it's quite often, it's not about there being a very clear signal or a smoking gun, as we might describe it. We're often looking at like different pieces of data and trying to build a story around that. So, for example, what do people buy? Is there any difference in when they shop and when they choose? How long does it take to find a particular pack, for example? Do they need longer when you change the design? Does this have implications in terms of what you're trying to do? What's driving people's response, of course, what are the features in the design which are resonating with people? And how does that impact, your expectations of a brand as well? What's your expectations of the experience as a function of packaging change? When we research pack, we're often like looking at these little pieces of change in the data in order to build a credible and comprehensive story for our clients so that they can make the right decision. In all cases, whether it's a significant change or a limited change, getting closer to real is really what matters, and it drives us as a research agency. So that can be closer to real in terms of the environments that we present to our respondents, to our consumers. The choices that they make need to be made in a close to real environment, particularly at the validation stage when our clients are making big decisions. So we want to do that, whether that be online or in person. But also the focus today, how is measurements, how is getting closer to real in terms of the measurements that we take, how does that influenced by the technologies available to us in the field of neuroscience. So very briefly, I just want to talk about close to real environments because ultimately we want to measure behavior at Ipsos. We want to get closer to the reality of what people do rather than what they say. So when we talk about eye tracking, again, that's going to be behavioral response. So what are people doing behaviorally when they're exposed to stimulus? When we measure choice, again, we also want to get closer to real because how people respond in an environment which is typical for them, and this is a website developed by Ipsos to measure how a new pack performs within the context of its competition. You can see that it's a very kind of familiar, it's a very boring exercise in some cases because, it's just people exposed to an Amazon site, they're looking at products, they're making their choices, and then they're going to leave the exercise. But that's the whole point. We want to get close to that reality. And the importance for that in this particular case is that If we're going to measure something like sustainability, which is really important in packaging, as I mentioned, we want to really understand the true outcome of those types of initiatives. Of course, attitudinally, we all feel good about positive, benefits of sustainability. The use of ocean plastic is a very resonant theme, for example, and we tested that with our brand here. But what happens when we increase price slightly? Our behaviour is going to change, and that was important for this type of experiment, to really understand behavioural change as a function of sustainability claims, in order that we're ultimately making the right type of decision based on behaviour, based on outcomes, rather than based on some sort of claimed intent. So that's the kind of context. Now we'll move into the real meat of our presentation today, and that's talking about closer to real measurement in the context of PAC. And we do that really in 4 main ways that you see here, and briefly going through 3 of them, and then focusing on eye tracking, of course. Early stage, we want to measure things like response time, because that, what fires together is really, getting closer to real. If people are responding quickly, it kind of implies that there's more resonance for a particular issue. We want to get that view when we measure, for example, attributes. We also want to apply cognitive load to people in an early screening stage. If we screen packs in a very sort of abstract way on our mobile phones, we want to make sure that we're never going to get closer to a shopping situation in that case. But what we can do is apply a cognitive load in order that we get closer to kind of more automatic decisions, even in a very sort of controlled, abstract research context. So even at very early stage, very light methodologies, we're applying techniques like that. We use galvanic skin response on occasion in PAC when something is really significantly different from a functionality perspective, or for example when a very new material is being used in a different category. Occasionally that can warrant the use of a technique which measures electrical conductivity on skin in order to gauge whether there's an emotional response to stimulus. So this on occasion has application. We get closer to real in terms of retail labs, so measuring how people shop in a store-like environment, and we can see an example here from Italy in Milan, where people are being watched. They are on view with a camera, as we can see the guy here. Of course, they sign up for this and they know what's happening. They have eye tracking glasses on, and they're asked just to go and explore and shop in a given category, or even without a category definition in some cases. And then finally, the subject of today, eye tracking. So whether that be early stage or late stage, like the retail lab, this is really about getting closer to our behavioral response to stimulus. Now, the interesting thing here, and the subject for today particularly, is that this is increasingly online. And that means that we've got very many more applications for this type of approach, which really becomes, as a PAC researcher, a really interesting and exciting development. So I am a market researcher. I'm not a neuroscience, so I'm going to be brief in terms of the science of visual attention. And I think probably in the first meeting in this series, you heard Manuel talk on some of those issues. So what really, visual attention, what does it mean? Of course, the visual system plays a massive role in terms of the issues or the features or where we attend to in our brain function. We're constantly receiving important information through visual stimuli. Attention, of course, is really relevant in terms of how we process. If we're attending something, then we've got a greater capability to process something, and that type of attention, therefore, leads into what we prioritize in our brain systems. And of course, when we process new stimuli, we have to do that. We have to apply cognitive resource to that event. So, the more fluent a packaging is, for example, the less cognitive resource needs to be applied, the more sort of automatic our decisions and associations might be. So when we look at our packaging example from today, we're going to see that in some cases, or in one particular case, a more kind of fluent design in terms of extending the role and accentuating the role and highlighting the role of a particular feature really goes hand in hand with being able to make sort of easier decisions, and ultimately those decisions we want to trigger, of course, is a choice decision. So that is very briefly on the science. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in this regard, but what I am hopefully is somebody who can talk about application in a meaningful way for you, our clients, and our fellow researchers. So the type of eye tracking used by Ipsos today is really represented by kind of good, better, best. At the higher end of the scale, we're using wearable devices from Tobii. So this allows the type of activity that you've seen in the retail lab just then. So people can walk about freely. They have got full, full freedom to explore whatever stimulus is in front of them. They're moving. All of these, these inputs are being very accurately tracked and ultimately processed. And that really is the high end of eye tracking, suitable for kind of full shopper research. Or user experience research as well. The middle application, let's say, or the middle capability is dedicated hardware. So it's a kind of USB device, a bit like a webcam, but very specific to eye tracking, which is plugged into a computer or a screen and allows the device to project infrared or near infrared light sources at the eye so that it can measure the response with a very great accuracy as well, but in a kind of static screen-based environment. And then at the left-hand side of the chart here, the early stage of the good, better, best scenario, we have our webcam approach, which is what we're going to talk about today. And the interesting thing about webcam is, webcam research is that it uses a webcam. We don't need dedicated hardware. We therefore can use the computers that our respondents access in their home. They don't need any particular hardware. They don't even download an app. They just go into a website. And really this means that we've got potential at scale to bring eye tracking to very many new use cases. And briefly, those use cases tend to be about pack design, about assessing the impact of simple shelf design as well, advertising and websites. Now, how this works, or what it delivers rather, is what you see here. So heat maps are the kind of poster child for eye tracking. It's what we associate with eye tracking. It's a visual representation of a lot of data. And they are very interesting in their own right, especially if we see them in a kind of time context, and that's what we're going to use today. The issue with heat maps, however, is that it's an aggregated view, so you can get the same sort of heat on a pack, whether, for example, you have 10 people looking at an item for 1 second, or one person looking at an item for 10 seconds. The representation of that in a heat map is going to be the same. So behind that representation, there can be a very different story. Are you or is the feature in the pack something which gets a lot of attention by a lot of people, but it's very quick? Or is it something which gets very little attention, but people are really focused and potentially applying a lot of cognitive resource to that particular feature? So heat maps need to be presented in context to how they're measured. More interesting from a researcher perspective, I would say, is what we call areas of interest. Now, the same data is being used here, but it's being presented in a different way. And there are three main measures that we use at Ipsos. What we do with our Nescafe pack here is we just predefine what is an area of interest in terms of the design. So it's the logo, it's the cup of coffee, it's the bean, it's the top, H1 there, and then it's some information about the product in the bottom right. And what we can tell with our three measures here is the proportion of people who looked at a specific area of interest for a relevant measure of time, a minimum measure of time. We can tell how long they spent on that area of interest, and also we can tell the order or how long it took for them on average to get to that area of interest. And these measures are going to be critical when we interpret how design functions and how good design works better than less good design, for example. So when we look at our results, just have in mind these three measures. So the proportion of people fixating on an area of interest, how long for, and how long they took to get there. Behind that data, there are additional deliverables, and I'm just going to highlight a few on the left here. So as well as understanding what people looked at and the percentage of people who saw something, we can also understand the percentage of people who looked at an area of interest, maybe went away and then came back again, because that can be interesting in design. You know, is it something which is causing confusion, or is it something which is intriguing, for example? We can understand, you know, the average order of fixation of an area of interest relative to other areas of interest. So, you know, is it the logo, which on average is first, followed by, you know, the top of the cap? That order obviously has implications. And also the percentage of people, for example, who've seen a particular area of interest first relative to others. So there are, even though I'm going to focus on the previous data that I presented, there are additional bits of granularity that you can look at. Also, what you should be aware of is, although the focus is on eye tracking, as we can see from our provider here, a lady called Shannon in the US, when she looks at the webcam, her face is being coded as well. So we're actually able to do some basic facial coding with this methodology as well at the same time. Now, that doesn't really have a great deal of application in pack testing, because packs tend to not really elicit a, you know, an emotional response. They tend not to, you know, be or really raise happiness. We can see, however, a quite extreme example, if we're honest, of a dog food packaging here, which with a coding of joyousness, we can see that after about 3 seconds on average, people are working out that the teeth in our packaging here are actually the product itself. So, you know, this is a pack which gives a window on the product, but also in a very sort of humorous way presents the dog's teeth. And we can see the level of you know, joy around that rising when people kind of get the message. And that's, you know, as I say, that's an unusual example. Unfortunately, we tend not to test packaging like this. That tends to be a very rare occasion, but do know that the, you know, the functionality of the approach does allow for that type of measure. Very quickly, it's not a presentation on how things work, but I think it's relevant to understand that, you know, our respondents, they get a link. So our research that was done, as was mentioned, in a couple of weeks or a week or so, and is being delivered today, was 240 respondents in Serbia were sent a link. They clicked on the link, they gave their permissions, you know, they had a webcam as well, of course, and that meant they entered the research. There's a short calibration exercise. So the algorithm wants to really understand, you know, the distance, for example, where you are from the screen, and then they want to understand the dimensions of your screen as well. And they'll do that by putting a series of calibration points. This is all happening very quickly. It's about a 15-second exercise. But basically, the calibration goes on the screen. The eye tracking is measured through the webcam, and, you know, the machine is learning what's going on in terms of all of the bits of the variable, which is going to really understand whether you're looking at something or not. Stimulus is presented. Again, usually very quick. It could be like a 5-second exposure, 10-second exposure. Our bases, typically, we want 40 usable respondents at the end of this exercise. And on those 40 people, you know, with a frame rate of about 25 samples per second, you know, every second for every respondent, 25 pieces of data are being measured. With those 40 people with a typical eye tracking length, you know, you're getting 10,000 data points. So there's a lot of data going into this approach, even if, you know, the exercise is very brief, even if the sample sizes are, on the face of it, relatively small. So, you know, this is a relatively new technology. Does it work? We can look at some Ipsos R&D on that point without any data behind it. But, you know, the task for our respondents here in Mexico was, can you find Twining's wild berry tea? And if I just play the video here, you can see, you know, the aggregate view from 40 people in terms of their ability to locate that. So it took them a kind of few seconds to you know, orientate themselves. They came in from the right because of the calibration. They went to the middle, and then eventually they landed on Twining's, and it took about 3 seconds to do that. If you look at this other example from Herka, a brand called Nioria, how long did it take for people to find that? Again, the purpose of this experiment, the calibration was in the right hand side at the time, but we can see people come in very quickly, and even Literally it took about a second and a half before they were identifying the brand that we wanted them to look for. So even without doing extensive R&D, in terms of face value, go and find that brand. This is the data that came back. We're getting a very good a piece of evidence that in fact the eye tracking is doing a very good job in terms of matching the reality of what people are doing. Now, of course, we want to operate this at scale, so we need to go further than just face value recognition that things are working well. So back in 2020, we also ran a more significant R&D where we compared 3 suppliers on the basis of what you see here. 3 suppliers of webcam versus our own Tobii hardware. We did this in Mexico City because we've got this very nice Ipsos house where our hardware is neatly in place. And we tested, as I say, 3 suppliers. We tested 15 different types of stimulus. You can see there are 3 types of stimulus there, 5 in each case. And for each of those stimulus, we coded our areas of interest, our AOIs. And the point of this exercise was really to understand at a very granular level what is the comparison of webcam to central location. And we can see here, just looking at catching effect, for example, how long it took respondents to fixate on a given AOI. We can see, again, sort of face value, that there's a very good correlation between a central location and the best case webcam provider that we looked at. And those levels of correlation were found to be very satisfactory from the Global Science Organization. Manuel, who you might have heard from, led this research in the first session. And that gave us the confidence to say, yes, this has got application. We want to do that at scale. And we want to work with our partner, Tobii, in this case, on bringing this to our clients. So, of course, we want to give appropriate guidance for use as well. And that means that areas of interest, we can't get down to a very granular level. Webcam eye tracking isn't as good as hardware-based eye tracking. We need to be very clear on that, but it's good enough. It's good enough for the applications that we see here. So whether we're looking at individual packaging, whether we're looking at very simple shelves like you see in the middle here, we can be confident that we're measuring that accurately, and I think the video reflects that well. When it comes to more complex shelves that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen here, the guidance from Ipsos is to treat this more at a kind of brand family level. We can still understand, people's navigation paths at shelf, what they focus on, where they go next, ultimately what they attend to. But we really recommend doing that at a more of a brand family level, because getting down to individual SKUs, the webcam isn't accurate enough for that, because our areas of interest, 5% screen width, 7% screen height, that really should be the kind of rule that we apply to this. So we're happy that the methodology works, and also we're happy that there are use cases which are very relevant to our clients. So with all that in mind, let's look at what we've actually done. And Kovac, I hope I present that correctly. It's, I don't know what time in Serbia, 3:30. Thursday, Thursday's the new Friday, as they say. So it's definitely not far off from thinking about beer, but we've got some data here that really reflects beer. And our brand Kovac, as I understand, it's a common surname in Serbia, meaning blacksmith. We've got 2 inspirations here. So let's imagine that our marketing director, whose name happens to be Kovac, he says, look, let's launch a brand called Kovac, and come back to me with two design routes. And we can see here that we've come back with 2 very different design routes. One which plays on the idea of look, and you kind of make your own look, and that's the representation of Kovac on the left-hand side, using the symbol, the 4-leaf clover, associated with Ireland in my mind. But that's the kind of central feature of the design. On the other hand of this, in route 2, we've got something which is a lot probably closer to the idea of a Kovac, of a blacksmith, which plays out those kind of metallic cues. It's got the horseshoes, obviously one of the things they produce, and very clearly, if we look at the top of the pack there, it's got a very differentiating feature as well, potentially, which is the cap. So what did we do? The point I want to get across here is that the application of eye tracking, because it's enabled through the webcam, it's really got scale. So we can apply this type of approach, which going back 3 or 4 years was really for late stage validation. We can apply it in much earlier stages. So we can do very simple experiments, but those which are really quite powerful, because they mix the the behavioral response, the more indirect, implicit response, which is coming from what we attend to, with the more explicit views that we offer in a typical research study. So whether I like it or not, whether I want to buy it, or indeed what particular features of design are interesting to me. So really, this page represents the questionnaire flow. Eye tracking is the the initial part of the research, but then we dig into some of the explicit diagnostic features which are going to help pull things together. And again, the context here, as I mentioned, is about putting pieces of the puzzle together. So 10 minutes an interview, very short, 120 per cell, monadic, online in Serbia. It was done last month, or this month actually, in June. And amongst a general population. One thing I haven't mentioned yet so far, and I'll go back to it, is because we rely on our webcams, and we rely on our respondents, a lot of the sample that we get is not actually going to be used for eye tracking. As I mentioned earlier, we only need a base of about 40 people anyway. We only need 40 usable cases because we're taking 25 measures every second. So we're getting a lot of data from those 40 people. But like me, sometimes your room is a bit dark. Sometimes the light is behind you, so you're kind of just getting a silhouette. Maybe I'm moving my head about too much, and the algorithm can't cope with that. So basically, from your beginning sample of 120, we're going to take about 40 usable in this case, and that is very much in line with the general expectation. We'll probably only achieve about a 30% to 33% usability rate. So that that's in some senses that sounds like an issue, but it's absolutely not. It's about being enabled to get scale. Of course, you lose some people along the way, but you're losing data which is not good enough. You can control that type of data in a central location with a dedicated hardware. We can't do that with webcam, so therefore the compromise is that we lose some people. Now the good thing is those people are still part of the survey. They're still entering the explicit data. They don't know if they're going to be used for the eye tracking or not. So you're getting at an explicit level exactly the same piece of data, and you're getting that at a quantitative base as well. Now if we look at the findings here, these are our two shelves. Now we're not pretending that this is a supermarket or a grocery store in Serbia, but what it does do is it represents the competitive environment, and it represents some of the big brands. It gives proportions consistent with their weight in the market, and it's a controlled experiment as well, because really what we want to know is how does this design compare to this design here. Now we can see in our 10-second eye tracking here, if we just start here, people do begin in the middle of the shelf, but what we'll see is that they quickly kind of navigate to Heineken. This is the aggregate view. They're looking around this middle shelf, and then after about 4 seconds, they're noticing Kovac. Again, I'll do that because 10 seconds is quick. We're giving people a fast exposure. So yeah, if they start in the middle, go to the kind of top left, Heineken is quite impactful. And then eventually, they do reach Kovac, and they reach that with certain, with I guess a promising degree of intensity as represented by the heat map there. We can do the same for route 2. Again, this is just directional at this point. People again go top right. Heineken is something which is really standing out there, and then they go to Kovac again after about 4 seconds. And in this case, they spent a bit more time towards the bottom of the shelf. Now that is a visual representation of what people are doing at an aggregate level. What we'll want to convert that to is something that we can kind of compare on a more meaningful level, let's say. So again, I want to contrast the heat map, which is it's candy, it looks cool, so that's what's happening. I'll try and follow along with what's going on, but actually what we want to do is make sure that we're looking at the data behind that as well. So if we compare our two packs here, on average it took about 4 seconds for people to navigate to Kovac. On average, they spent about 0.7 seconds there. What's interesting between the two is that directionally, we're getting a few more visitors for route 1. So, despite there's this potentially very interesting new bottle cap here, There is an advantage in terms of, you know, the amount of visibility, if I can call it that, the amount of people fixating on that design. Actually, directionally, green route one has an advantage here. So, you know, the immediate kind of outcome here is that things are pretty similar, and maybe route one has a bit of an advantage. And as I mentioned earlier, pack testing is about trying to put those pieces of the puzzle together in order that you come up with a good recommendation. Now, what we're going to see away from the shelf is when we look at our individual packs, is we're going to see, for example, the Shamrock is absolutely key to route one, and we can see that again in the video, a quick 5-second burst here. We can see that there's a lot of attention to the Shamrock. It's what people really attend to initially. They take a quick check of the Kovac name and then they begin to look around a little bit. Route two, what we're seeing again actually is the label being front and center. It starts off with a focus on the brand name Kovac. It moves to the symbols a little bit, and then, as you might expect, you get a bit more movement towards the top of the pack here. So again, that in itself is diagnostic. It gives us an impression of what reaction the designs are causing in people. It gives us an idea of the you know, the hierarchy of communication, the type of navigation that people have. But again, you know, we can substantiate that a little bit more as well. So with our AOI data, we know that the Shamrock is the first element which is fixated on. Everybody sees it. They spend on average 0.9 seconds, and they arrive as well after 0.9 seconds as well. There's the definition here. If we just take that in order to represent what we've just seen in a heat map, we can see that people then are intrigued a little bit by the you know, the text on the left-hand side. They're picking out the hat as well, and going in order of viewing here. They're then looking at the brand name. It's getting a little bit less here. You know, 85% versus 97%. Then they're going up the pack and picking out the symbol. 41% are doing that, and they're doing that on average after 2.5 seconds. And then, you know, they might focus on the top of the pack as well. So there's more detail behind this, but I just wanted to look at, you know, the general outcome as we see it. If we look at route two, then like route one, the focus is on the label, but it's the brand name which is catching the eye first. 93%, very quickly, 0.6 seconds, and they're spending 0.5 seconds on that. So they're spending, you know, less time than on the Shamrock in route one. After the brand name, they're coming to the symbol here at very high rates. 90% are fixating on that, and they're spending about a second. It's quite a, you know, relatively long time, because there's actually quite a lot going on there. You know, there's a horseshoe, there's a horse jumping over something, and then, you know, there's some kind of ingredients there as well. After that, you know, we can dig in if we wanted to specific features. So, you know, within that 90% of people, there are 83% who are looking at the horse specifically. There are 86% looking at the broader symbol. You know, we can get to that level of detail. A few people look at the detail on this pack as well. You know, 0.5 liters and the strength. But you know, all this is going on before they reach the top. So this is in order. So you know, what they're looking at in this pack is all of that stuff on the label before they attend to you know, what is potentially a very differentiating feature here. Now, the important thing on this point is that only 69%, I say only, that's still a good proportion, but you know, it's significantly smaller than the 90% who are focusing on the label. So you know, the focus is on the label in pack design, in beer, with this type of case, and that potentially is taken a little bit away from you know, some of the features which are differentiating in this pack. So the special cap is only viewed later. So that's the type of finding that we'll get from the eye tracking. And what we'll do now is just put the things together, because this is where you know, things begin to make sense. And the point that I want to make, and hopefully I've made it a little bit so far, is that you can't just rely on eye tracking. You need you know, data to help add, you know, substance to the behavioral response that we're seeing. And one way to do that, of course, is, you know, what's our spontaneous outtake when we look at those packs? So people, you know, they haven't been prompted in any particular way. They've seen the shelf, they've seen our pack. They actually have seen a competitor as well, but we're not going to talk about that today. And then they'll do the rest of the questionnaire. And again, this is all happening within 10 minutes. So we can see from our route 1 here, it's an interesting pack. Some people are making spontaneous association with Ireland, also getting the idea that it's about luck, being lucky potentially. There's some fun and cool elements in there as well, and it's overall kind of interesting. On the right hand side, we can see explicitly that it's all about the bottle cap. So they've gone through our exercise, they've looked at the shelf, they've looked at the pack for 5 seconds. We begin to ask them questions now, and when we ask those questions, we've got the pack in front of them, and with this kind of sustained view, we can say, oh yeah, the bottle cap, that's interesting, that's kind of top of mind. How would I describe this? I'd focus on the bottle cap. We also see some other associations. It's plain, so a bit of a negative sentiment here, even like bad and retro, but that's the unfiltered view from our respondents here. But clearly there's quite a different response between two quite different packs. We can go a bit further than that and look at an explicit level and what we call hot zones. So again, those same areas of interest that I described with eye tracking, we can also do that at an explicit level as well. So on the eye tracking, we go back and now thinking about what you like about the pack, please click on the features in front of you. So our respondents can click, for example, on the 4-leaf clover when they ask about what they like, and we can see relative to other features in the pack that's a very dominant like. So 65% like that relative to other features in the design. Dislikes are quite few. It's quite untypical. It's quite typical for a pack to really enrage people to mention dislikes. But there are a couple of pieces of guidance there as well. But again, very contrastful to what we see on the right-hand side. So consistent with the spontaneous response, we're seeing at this kind of hot zone, explicit, what do you like, dislike, what do you find new and different. We can see on that basis that the cap is really the feature which resonates. So when they process this, when they look about in detail at the pack, when they're asked to describe it, when they're asked to kind of give their sentiment, then the cap is actually something which is really dominating. And that is a really important finding. So what we've got at a implicit level, a behavioral level, is the cap. It's noticed, but it's not noticed as priority. It's kind of secondary in terms of how the design is working. At a more explicit level, when they've looked at the pack, they've been exposed to it multiple times, only then are they talking about this in much more emphatic terms. And that's got a real impact in terms of how design works, because obviously if you've got something which is positive but is kind of coming down later in the day in terms of how people are processing it, then you're not necessarily taking full advantage of what that positive feature is. And that's really the finding of the research here. So when we put that together, again, reinforcing some of the findings that we have, even though we've got something which is really highly liked, 72%, is very different, 78% say that, we don't see that reflected at an overall level in terms of how people are processing COVACH in route 2. Actually, at a marginal level, directional level, route 1 green has the advantage. We can see it's a bit more liked. 67% differentiation is equal. So even though it doesn't have this very differentiating feature of the cap, green 1 is still as differentiated overall as red. It's perceived more premium. The expensive associations are perceived 47% versus 36, and actually directionally 74 versus 65 also gives us a good indication that it meets my needs better as well. So what are the implications of this? Well, route 1, appreciation driven by the shamrock, we've seen that. This is what people fixate on first. It's also their most lasting impression. It's what they focus on more. So the most people focus on it. It's the feature which they focus on for the longest, and it's the feature that they see first. That's a major advantage for route 1 versus route 2, because it's also the feature which is most liked. So that is really driving the overall impression of this brand. That initial exposure to the 4-leaf clover is really driving a more positive outcome than is the case in route 2. So route 2's label is also the first point of fixation, particularly on the brand name. We saw that COVACH. The response, however, in terms of appreciation, and novelty is lower. So if I just, sorry, because I was quite quick there, if you look at the response at an explicit level on the label, it's really quite disappointing. You know, what do you like? Only 3% mentioned the name. Much more people dislike it. And these features around the symbol are also quite, not much is happening there. So you've got this is the initial point of focus and really quite a limited response in terms of, how you feel about that. So the response is focused here, but the appreciation is lower. The explicit response, however, when people are asked to sit down about that is more about the bottle cap. This is, however, coming relatively late to people's attention. So as we put this together, what we learned from this type of exercise is that, understanding change requires an holistic understanding. We need to understand, for example, not just eye tracking in isolation, but all the other sort of layers of evidence behind that. In terms of the particular research results from this case, because the focus is on the label, people's immediate impressions of route 1 are more positive than route 2. The bottle cap, which is novel and potentially quite expensive to produce, even though it's highly regarded, it's not enough to compensate for this underperformance in the label. It comes too late. After 3 or 4 seconds. Your focus initially has been on a feature which is not really appreciated. You don't really like the Kovac branding. You don't really like the design behind it either. The bottle cap, which you do like, is secondary, and it's in the context of something which you're actually not finding that appealing. So route 1 in this case, in our for our client would be the recommendations to take forward. But putting the data together, we can make that with more confidence. So again, I really want to stress the point. If we ran this test purely at an explicit level, we would see an outcome like this, like directionally higher KPIs, but we'd see this result as well. So this result really says that, well, I don't really understand why route 2 is not doing better, because the cap is doing so well. If you only had the explicit data behind that, you would be, I wouldn't say you'd struggle, but you wouldn't be that confident to say, well, I think definitively route 1 is the winner here. So what eye tracking allows us to do is bring that confidence, bring that level of understanding of the nuance, because we can understand the order of communication. And obviously design is about pushing what's positive. It's about having a very fluent and meaningful communication hierarchy, and route 1 does that a lot more effectively than route 2. So if our marketing director, nevertheless, whose name is Kovac, really wants the bottle cap as well, what do we do? How do we advise him in this case? And again, that advice is going to be on the basis of the explicit data and also the implicit data. We know that the bottle cap is really well regarded. So how would we do it in practice? What recommendation would we make? Well, actually, we wouldn't need to think that hard, because if we look in market at the one brand who does this already, they themselves have recognized very clearly that this is where the action should be. So we don't want to distract people in the middle of the bottle. We will actually, when it comes to usage, we're going to have this nice embossing. It's going to feel really good in the hand. But Grolsch have well understood how to position the label in order to emphasize and profit from a key differentiating feature that this packaging holds. So again, being able to reach that type of conclusion with confidence is really well supported by the combination of eye tracking with the explicit data, and I hope that example reinforces that well. And I'm really pleased actually with how this how this case study turned out, because we obviously didn't know how things would work in practice, but what eye tracking is, it's not. If you look at some case studies that might be presented online, it seems to show that the eye tracking is just so clear that it's inevitable, that pack A is the winner, or everything makes sense because it's explained by the eye tracking. That's not the case. We need to use eye tracking in a proper way, and we need to incorporate it with the other features that we do as researchers, every day of our lives, which is putting together pieces of information in order to build a story and a narrative to our clients. So this, I hope, is coming across today. This value that eye tracking brings in a webcam context, it's fast. We're talking days and the processing of the data is also almost immediate. It's really cost effective relative to other types of eye tracking. Of course, if you just did a study with explicit data, it's going to add cost, but the value it brings, in my opinion, far outweighs the the additional investment. Great thing about eye tracking is it's intuitive. That's why I showed the videos before. You can see what people on average are looking at, and that gives a lot of credibility when you begin to report back your finding, your recommendations. It's legitimate. We've done our R&D, and I shared that data earlier. It works in the cases that we want to use it for. And also, this point about getting closer to real, it's those behaviors, that behavioral response that we measure through our approach. What's next? With our provider, Sticky, they last week have launched, or wasn't last week, yeah, they launched it last week, but they told us about it about a month ago, we've got good, better, best today. But before that, we're going to have mobile eye tracking. So that's something which is very exciting, because I just checked the stats before the meeting. 48% of the global population is carrying around a device which has a camera, a front-facing camera, a smartphone. So our reach potentially in terms of measuring response is even higher than it is today with webcam. So again, as good researchers, we want to validate the use cases, and that's what we're doing right now. We actually included it in this research that we've seen today, and in due course we'll share that, and we'll come back with our findings. But hopefully it will have good use cases as well for application of eye tracking going forward. So that, I think, is on time, more or less. I hope it was a mix of practical with a tiny bit of theory, but also with a strong research lens. And I'd just like to thank the team in Serbia for the creative development of Kovac and partnering with us on what I think was a very cool case study. That's me.
Thank you very much.
So what's next?
Yeah. Thank you. Can you please mute yourself, because people can hear me through your computer. Thank you. So thank you, Jan. It was very impressive and very useful even for us who are involved in the whole study and everything. I suppose that our clients could see the application of eye tracking, and that they receive several strong messages that we sent. The first one is about the reliability of the online research. I mean, that's in a way that's very agile. It can be used every day, everywhere, and also it's very actionable. So I suppose that we can use it for many other cases, not only for pack testing. Can you tell us something about that? Can we use it, for example, for video materials, or I don't know, some of our clients ask us about shopper studies, decision tree, and things like that. I know that sometimes it's not that the best solution, but what you can tell us about that?
Yeah, briefly, the way to think about it, well, first of all, video is possible, just to answer that question quickly. But the way to think about webcam eye tracking is that it's accurate to a certain degree. So it's, I think it was 9% width, 7% height on your screen. So basically, if you can picture a stimulus, and in our materials, we've got a grid, for example, which you can overlay. If you overlay that grid and look at your stimulus and say that's going to give me meaningful information on what I want to look at, then it's applicable, and it's applicable to any visual stimulus. Now, my focus is on pack, but a lot of the time eye tracking is used, for example, on website usability. So obviously online is a big issue in terms of communication. Is your banner ad getting through? Is the placement going to affect people's attention? All of those features can be measured, again, very reliably, even more reliably in the case of web website design, because there's a lot of like white space often, so it's really easy to pick out areas of interest. But that's the correct way of thinking about it. Think about it as stimulus agnostic. You can put anything there, but it needs to be defined by the proper use needs to be defined by that kind of grid mentality that I mentioned. And that means, for example, that if you're looking at, you mentioned shopper research, decision tree type of research. The thing with decision tree is that your decisions might very well be impacted by, you're looking for a certain flavor, or you're looking for gluten-free, or you're looking for whatever it might be. And that is a very detail-oriented, nuanced process. Often, it's not always the case. Sometimes it's just I want a light beer, whatever it might be. But a lot of decision tree research needs that level of detail. Now, with a webcam, you're not really going to be able to represent that, because again, with that grid mentality, you could do a very simple shelf, but if you want to represent a real store, then it's a bit of a stretch. Well, it's a stretch of the approach. So for that type of research, you want to be thinking about dedicated hardware. So it's really important. It's a very good question, because it's really important that the output in the end looks the same, whether you've used a webcam, whether you've used a computer screen device, or whether you've used the glasses. Now, they are hugely different in terms of cost and application. The output actually tends to look the same. So we really need to be careful as researchers to apply the approaches correctly. And that's a really important point.
Thank you for your point at the end, that we need to be very careful with application and correct way of application. So we're running out of time, unfortunately. We have a lot of questions. I suppose that our clients also have a lot of questions. So I call them to. I invite them to write to us, to ask questions about this method, about the opportunity to test their materials. I would emphasize that we are able to do it in Ipsos, within Ipsos Strategic Marketing Panel, online panel. As you saw today, we actually show you the case that is done here in Serbia right now. So we are able to offer everything that is presented today, and also we are equipped with knowledge and skills to interpret data, and also we have experts like Jan Payne, which was today with us. So thank you. I hope you have enjoyed this session, and also I remind you of the next section, that is facial coding, that we will talk about testing video materials and testing emotional reactions that are provoked by video materials and other stimuli. So stay tuned, stay with us. Thank you for your attention today, and see you soon. Thank you, Jan.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Snezana. Bye-bye.
Thank you.